Now that you can almost see, it's used for, you were down the farm, you saw the hills. You use that hoe to press, the hills up. You grew your tobacco plants from seed in coal flats, put a lot of manure, they became hotbeds, and you grew them, and then you built little, hills, and then you stuck your plant down and you pressed it up with this. And well, here at Mount Vernon, the slaves had a basic recipe. What it was cornmeal, which they were issued. This was part of their food supply. They were always guaranteed a grain and protein. And so what they would do is to put hot water in the cornmeal, press it out, and then they would cook it up in some animal fat. And lots of times they would do this in the evening, at night, after they came in from the fields, because they had to be out in the fields as soon as it was daylight, and they would take these along with them. They would be hard. Now wasn't their breakfast, you see. The rhythm of the farm, you go out early, you work, you break for breakfast. The general break, at his break at 7 a.m. It was usually the study, 5 o'clock in the morning or earlier than that. And then you ate your breakfast, and then you went back out to work. Midday meal, rest, more food. And then in the farm, you had to go back out to work. There were always things to do. Candlelight, we had supper. And in Virginia, we often say, well, for years we did, you have breakfast, dinner, and supper. And sometimes people look at you, what are you talking about? Of course, the big news is the end of the day, in the middle of the day. So now, General Washington, you will get his recipe. He did have egg in it, it was the flour, cornmeal, and then there was some egg, and you get the recipe. So they will taste a little bit differently. Now, over here, I'm attempting to cook something cake. I had a good fire a little while ago, and it died down. But, and I got a few out here. You will not have to eat these. This is like the Food Network. We've got them prepared already in advance. And they're a little bit different, but of course what I'm interested in here is the butter. And I would like someone to step up and start turning. In the heat, it's not easy, but let me tell you about butter in Mount Vernon. George Washington always wanted to establish a dairy business. He was such an entrepreneur. Now, dairying was women's work. And that was pretty obvious here at Mount Vernon. He was buying his butter, cheese, anything like that, up until his marriage, 1759. And then when he brought Mrs. Washington and her 2 children here, she brought along slaves that were dairy maids. And all of a sudden, the orders go out for these very shallow tin pans. And what they would do in your the building, they called it a still house. After the milk would, they would bring it in, and they would put it in these little flat pans. There was a brick going down into the ground, so it was a little cooler. The dairy house was, and they let it set out for about 12 hours. And of course, what they're trying to do is to establish a herd on it. Now in the winter, they'd have to leave it out a little longer. Then they would put it in a firkin or a crock and let it sit for 1 to 2 days. And you could make butter 30 to 45 minutes. Now this is, George Washington wanted to establish, something he could sell his butter locally to people. But there was a little problem with it. Well, let's talk about the cows. Here at Mount Vernon, he had different kinds of cows. They had the horns. Most of them were horned. And the foreigners would come from Europe and they'd say, in Virginia, they don't take very good care of their cows. They were almost half wild early on. In other words, they weren't stable. They were out there year-round, But George Washington, after the war, he decided that he was really going to concentrate on this. Because his cows, today, his cows had run from 500 to 700 pounds, just double that today. And the cattle, he would refer to black cattle and white cattle. That was not their color. White cattle are sheep. Cattle's just a name for everything. The black cattle were the cows, and they weren't black. They were red. We got some red Devon, like he had. You've probably seen them. And then they had pied, spots, brindle. They had like little stripes through them. And then there was some black ones. So they were different kinds. And he began really trying to take better care of them. This was part of his goals. Interesting enough, up in Pennsylvania, the cows seemed to do much better. They were larger. They gave more milk. You know why? Because in the winters, they were putting them inside, feeding them, fattening them up. That's what you do. You don't let them run, wild out in the fields. Well, he counted his cows at Union Farm. He had over 300 cows. Now, I'm using the term cows. They were the ones that gave the milk. These were multi-purpose cows. You got oxen from them, and you got heifers. Of course, that was your year-old cows. He would refer to heifers. Often they would be used for barbecues or things like this. And, well, as I said, the cows were milked. Then you had steers, and they were raised, strictly for the beef. Well, in the 18th century, the milk cows, you could milk them for 20 years. You know how long you can milk a milk cow now? 2 to 4 years if you're lucky. Because they have bred them to give so much more milk. Over in England, there's one cow, 17 gallons a day. George Washington was lucky he got 2 gallons a day from his cows. And their udders collapsed. And, so that's our beef, when it goes off to the butcher.
Is there any cows nowadays that will go that long?
Yes. You see what would happen. The cow has the calf. In the 18th century, they would nurse that calf. The cow would, maybe 40 to 60 days. Then the calf, would be taken away, and they would milk the cow for 5 months, and then the process started over. Now they take the calf away 1 to 2 days, and they milk for 10 months. So you see, it's very difficult. But they're feeding these cows so much better, and they're raising them for the milk. Well, General Washington, one of the last letters he wrote, I think it was very poignant. It was to his farm manager, James Anderson. This was in 1799, the 13th. Down the 14th. And he wrote to his farm manager, I didn't like the way those cows looked on Union Farm. They didn't look well stable to me. And he gave instructions. They were to be in shelter with thatched roof, corn husks on the floor with leaves over them. The slaves were to be sure to break the water, when it iced up in the winter. And they were to be fed, and they were to stay stable from the 1st of November, that's the date that he wanted, to the 1st of May. Then the cows would be put out in the fields. You saw our Virginia split rail, our snake fences. We call them Virginia snake fences. They're movable. So the instructions continue. You put them in a pasture. You leave them in there for a week. And of course, you manure in the pasture. Then you move them to another pasture. Make sure you don't get too many cows in for the pasture. He was still, thinking of this. And then in a letter right before this, he wrote to his farm manager and said, well, here we got all these cows. I'm getting over 1,000 gallons of milk from 300 and some cows. He was getting like 2 gallons a day. And I still have to buy butter from the family. How does this happen? Butter's not easy to make. Particularly in the heat, I can see in the summer. It doesn't work that well. But, of course, he found out that one of the overseer's wives was selling it to a place down in Alexandria. The overseers were allowed to have so much butter, and she was taking more than her share and selling it downtown. So he always, had these little problems. Please, someone start. Yes, if you would. Now, what I'm going to do if we ever get some butter, and I think we will, look, my corn cakes are cooking over here. The wood, I blame everything else. The wood's not good. It isn't, really, it isn't. And what I'm going to do after we get some chunks, I'll put ice in here, and you harden it up. And then using these paddles, if I'm really lucky, I'm going to squeeze it out very hard, and you get the buttermilk. and the slaves were the recipients of the buttermilk.